Welcome back to Advancing with Watercolor, and this is the second part of a series. We're painting in plein air in Boston on Wednesdays and Thursday mornings, and today we're in the North End, an older section of Boston that's on the waterfront near the downtown area. We're in a lovely park called the Paul Revere Mall, and it's a wonderful tree-lined park, plenty of shade, benches, a fountain, flanked by two beautiful churches, and a statue of Paul Revere, a big bronze statue that will be the subject for today. You can see my class is working hard, enjoying the warm summer air, enjoying the light of this morning. And so we're going to do a painting of this. The motif is Paul Revere. You can see the statue coming into the camera right now. And at this point, I've already done my painting, and I'm going to recreate the demo for you a bit later.
I like how all the
But I wanted to
painters
show you
are
some of
lined
the
up in a row
perspectives
here.
that we had when we go into the field. This is how we work, usually at an easel, in proximity to our subject. We try to find shade. All these things are helpful in creating a good experience. So here's my piece, looking towards Paul Revere. You can see the motif as I saw it, and you can see the painting as I interpreted it. I made a number of edits or changes, as you can see, while the statue and the figures and the backdrop and the trees remain. They've been altered tonally and also in terms of color. And I'm going to give you the reasons for this, or how it plays into my working thoughts. One of the things when setting up to do your motif, one of the first questions I ask myself when I'm starting to form my idea, starting to form my watercolor plan, composition, and I'm starting to form my thoughts about lights and darks. How am I going to best use lights and darks in my painting to, one, make the painting readable, make it clear, make it project the message that I want to project. I think this is an important thing for all painters to consider, is when we're painting, we're communicating. We have something to say. We have an idea we want to get across. And one of the tools in the visual language that really helps us express things clearly or subtly is our ability to portray lights and darks and how that brings forth our subject. Today is a changing day. The lights started off very cloudy and quiet, but we got glimpses of sunlight as we are setting up, and this is the motif that I wanted to paint, was a sunlit scene. So one of the first thoughts that crossed my mind is I need to use a contrast. I'm probably going to use a little stronger contrast to convey this idea of a bright morning light. And then the second, it's quickly followed by a second thought, which is, how do I show my main subject, in this case the statue of Paul Revere against a tree-lined arcade? How do I best show that? And I'm probably oversimplifying, but it's not a bad idea if you're working outside and getting used to building your paintings. I asked the question, is it a light against a dark or a dark against a light? A simple question that really gets my thoughts moving towards how I'm going to structure the lights and darks in the painting. And usually when you look up at your subject, you get a clear answer. Okay, look how dark the statue of Paul Revere is as it meets the sky. It's quite dark. And So the answer to my question, or my desire to get clarity, achieve some clarity with light and dark, is it's going to be a dark subject against a lighter background. Now, from this point, we can improvise. We can do all sorts of things. And in the case of my painting, I'm going quite light in the background with a few suggestions of the architecture to give us a backdrop, a feeling of the sky, a feeling of some buildings facing us. But look at, they're quite light, and these are going to dry even lighter. So if you look at the photograph, it'll make its way back into my screen here. You will see that there's some visual confusion because the background is quite dark against the statue, and I chose to make it lighter than what I was seeing. I also chose to make a bit of a play with color and a slight graded wash from top to bottom. And this helped me to exaggerate the feeling of light, as you'll see in the final piece. I do the same thing with the overhead trees, which I'm painting now. I want there to be a feeling of light moving across the scene from left to right. So I'm going to paint the foliage on the right-hand side a nice medium dark, but the foliage on the left-hand side will be noticeably darker. And some of that is apparent in the image, some of it is not. This was another choice that I made in thinking about lights and darks to reinforce the mood, reinforce the feeling of light in the scene, and make my visual statement a little clearer, a little more obvious. So this is the foliage that you see was done partially on dry paper, partially on wet paper, to give us a variety of edges, also to make it feel like it's coming out of the air, meeting with the air, and there's some space achieved by the edges that we created in the foliage above. And at this point I'm working on the main subject, which is the statue of Paul Revere. Here my thoughts and indeed my watercolor plan, I thought I should really make this as dynamic and as not as colorful, but as strong, dark, rich as I could. So I'm mixing on the paper a couple colors, burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, and it's important that I'm mixing them on the paper. I think they achieve a brighter finish while maintaining a dark aspect, and also they achieve sort of a constantly changing aspect, or constantly changing color, which I feel animates the subject. Even though it's a statue, I feel it gives a certain a feeling of a play of light, and so that the quality of the light on the statue is more animated by mixing colors on the paper. I have to be careful when doing that the consistency of the paint is relatively equal. By that I mean, if I'm picking up a burnt sienna, I want it to be about as thick as the ultramarine blue, and this way they kind of mix and merge in a more harmonious way. If it's one color is more diluted than another, then it can create pockets or mixtures that are going to fade off and become very pale. I want this to maintain sort of a tonal unity, because it is backlit, the sun is behind and to the left, and it's reading primarily as a silhouette. Even though I'm using a lot of color, it's reading primarily as a silhouette. So you can see as I'm working through this, trying to make it calligraphic, trying to be as brief as I can with the brush strokes and not overly polish the edges. Very conscious about the highlight on the horse's rump. I feel that's kind of a way to make it a little more three-dimensional. Some of the highlights on the shoulders on the tricorder hat, on the horse's rump, on the foundation of the statue. You see I'm leaving some lights, and those are to pick up on the overhead light as well as create a feeling of depth on the structure. So you can see the photograph once again, and you see some of the liberties that I'm taking. Notice the tree on the upper right. It looks too well groomed. The line is too even. So I made an effort to make it a more broken and varied line at the edge of the trees with more breaks in the foliage to look through to the sky. Also an interpretation. I'm keeping the background as it is, whereas if we look at the photograph, we see the background, the buildings are quite strong, quite dark. I want the statue and the figures to read on first glance with clarity and also with an expression of the strength of light. The strength of light means these elements need to be quite dark against a light. And that's how I feel we can communicate a bright lit morning, strong sun coming across the scene. What I'm doing now, I'm spending some time in this section to actually join darks. I know I'm painting figures and I'm painting shadows and I'm painting foliage, but I'm considering these as the strong midtones in the painting, and I'm connecting them. A figure abuts a shadow joins to the base, which in turn joins to two more figures, and I'll do this all the way across the painting. In one sense, it acts as a frame, kind of highlighting the horse and figure. In another sense, it creates an integrity to the construction, so that there's not too many gaps, not too many scattered pieces, I guess is a good way to put it. If your darks or midtones are feeling like scattered pieces, then it's going to be necessary at some point, or going to be practical at some point, to contrive a way to join them. In this case, you see the figures that I'm adding are doing just that. Some are darker, some are lighter, but basically all a representation of this mid-tone, and are connecting the painting through this lower third. In fact, when I start to paint the shadows, you see how this makes the whole lower section supportive of the figure, the strong dark figure of the statue that we're seeing now. So this painting, I did have some of these thoughts in my head as I'm painting it, but in large part it's happening as I see it on my paper. So I do make an occasional glance up at the subject, but I'm really much more focused on what's happening in the paper, and very aware of how these pieces need to be joined or need to be fashioned into something legible, such as a figure, or need to connect left to right, or need to transition from dark to light or warm to cool. I'm very aware of all these things as I'm painting shadows, figures, statues, foliage, buildings, whatever the object is. I'm also very aware of how light and dark it is, how cool and warm it is, how it's transitioning, and how it's connecting to other parts of the painting. So I can speak about it now that I'm kind of removed from the process, but this is pretty much what's going on in my mind as I'm looking for ways to not just paint a representation, but actually to make a more composed and well integrated image. And there's a lot of thoughts towards the abstract as I'm doing this. So you can see the lower section now, how it's meeting the statue and how it's supporting the feeling of the light that's raking across the scene. One more piece is sort of necessary to finish the composition, and this is the darker foliage that I spoke of earlier. In our photograph, you can see it. It's not quite as well, I'll say it, as beautiful as I'm doing it. The path of light through the foliage is kind of a strange shape in the photograph. I'm trying to make it a little more of an organic, beautiful shape. So we do deviate a lot from our subject with an idea that's guiding us. In this case, the idea that's guiding me is a dark against a light, and kind of capturing this morning light as it comes across the Paul Revere Mall. Those are thoughts that I try to keep in the front of my mind, and also I try to find ways to enjoy an expression of color or brushstroke or things like this while I'm painting. Now, the image is nearly finished in terms of its light and dark relationship. I believe you can see how the thought of a dark against a light was useful to me in composing this image and in thinking about how dark to go with the various colors that I'm using. In terms of color, I guess my thoughts have been primarily the complementary hues of red and green and how they work together to create a more colorfully active picture. The figures are important in all these different positions. On the far right, the way that they fade into sort of a quiet shadow. Figures, some main figures coming towards us in the lower part of the painting. Looks like a father and child. Another person very close to us. Staggering figures in this way helps to create depth in the painting. So I'm trying to capitalize on that. And I'll just continue to add to the larger shapes that I've created. Some smaller darks, some branches, some strokes for the pavement that helps to make the shadows feel a little more transparent. Some dry brushed windows or doorways on the distant buildings or architectural pieces. These are all done to create a sort of enjoyment in subtleties. The dramatic picture is already set. What we're adding now are some subtleties, and it makes the painting feel more complex when actually it's rather simple from the point of view of light and dark. We can always make it more complex, adding small passages and changes into those primary lights and darks. But I think one of the harder parts is to establish the lights and darks in your mind firmly before you start painting, especially if it moves away from what nature is showing you or moves away from the scene that you see in front of you. So I'm adjusting the feeling of the pavers or the masonry on the ground. This is done to give us some directionals, sure, but also to make the shadow, this deep dark shadow, to feel a little more transparent. It was feeling a little thick, so I decided to add these. And I'll follow with some highlights. Make the highlight on the coat or the hat a little more apparent. Put some highlights on the shoulders of figures. Any place where I feel the light can be represented or my figure can be, the pose can be strengthened sometimes by adding such a highlight. There you see it. This is pretty much the finished piece. You can see how the light and dark aspect is really the foundation of this painting. The color varies, the edges vary, but light and dark forms the foundation, and this was a primary thought that I had in my mind in beginning this painting. We're going to do a second image from the same location, and we're going to focus on the opposite. We're going to place a light against a dark area. We're going to turn 180 degrees and face another motif, and that'll be in the next video. So you can see a materials list of the things that I use in just about every painting if you read the description that accompanies this video. You can also find a link to my website, my Instagram page where I typically post new work, as well as sometimes I accompany the video with a PDF that explains things in greater detail. So I appreciate the comments, I appreciate all your support, and have a look at the next video.